Hello and welcome back to the report. A patient being treated at a Dallas hospital has tested positive for Ebola. This is the first case of the disease to be diagnosed in the United States. Yasmin Khatoon has more on this story and the rest of today's news.
US health officials have confirmed the first patient infected with the deadly Ebola virus in the country after flying from Liberia to Texas. The patient sought treatment 6 days after arriving and has been admitted to an isolation room.
It is certainly possible that someone who had contact with this individual, a family member or other individual, could develop Ebola in the coming weeks. But there is no doubt in my mind that we will stop it here.
The Texas Department of State Health Services said it was working with the CDC, the local health department, and the hospital to investigate the case and help prevent transmission of the disease. Israeli settlers have occupied 7 homes in a Palestinian neighborhood of occupied East Jerusalem under the protection of Israeli police. Palestinians have condemned the move made by the Jewish settlers.
الرئاسة الفلسطينية تدين بشدة هذه الموجة الاستيطانية الخطيرة، وللأسف الشديد جاءت تلك بعد تشجيع الإدارة الأمريكية بانتقادها لخطاب الرئيس أبو مازن، ونحن نطالب الإدارة الأمريكية بالضغط على إسرائيل أولا لوقف هذه النشاطات الاستيطانية وبشكل جدي، وليس فقط بالانتقاد العلني الذي لا يؤدي إلى شيء، بل باتخاذ الخطوات الضرورية لذلك.
Around 90 settler families currently live in Silwan among some 50,000 Palestinians.
5:30 الصبح سمعت حتى السياح، طلعت من البيت لقيتهم بينزلوا عن الابواب زي الشياطين هون ذول المستوطنين، ومسكين الولد ابني كان متعارك معهم طايحين في ضرب. هلا دخلت انا معهم ضربوني كمان معانا. قدرنا نحاول إشي لكن في 2 كانوا داخلين يعني كسروا الباب ودخلوا جوا الدار ما عرفناش نطلعهم. اجت الشرطه بعد ساعه او ساعه ونص يعني صارت تاكلنا احنا يعني.
Silwan has long been an objective for settler organizations, with many Jews believing that the ancient city of David once stood where the Palestinian neighborhood now stands. 2 bomb attacks took place in the Afghan capital earlier today, killing at least 7 people and wounding more than 15. This comes the day after the new government and the United States signed a long-delayed security agreement. Afghanistan's Interior Ministry said the targets were an army bus and a vehicle carrying Afghan army personnel. The Taliban have claimed responsibility for the attacks. RAF jets have carried out their first strikes on Islamic State targets in Iraq, attacking a heavy weapon position and an armed pickup truck. The Ministry of Defence said the attacks were in support of Kurdish units in the northwest of the country. The strikes come 4 days after the British Parliament approved military action in Iraq. About 40 nations are targeting IS, which controls parts of Iraq and Syria. The United States has been conducting airstrikes over Iraq since August 8th and Syria since last week. Speaking today, Australian Prime Minister Tony Abbott has said aircraft will join the US-led coalition. At least 35 people have been killed in a wave of car bomb and mortar attacks in mainly Shiite Muslim districts in Baghdad. There has been no immediate claim of responsibility for the attacks. Buildings were defaced and wreckage was scattered as people surveyed the scene in the early morning hours.
Well, let's move on to our next story. While the US releases another video showing successful airstrikes against the Islamic State targets in Syria and Iraq, including weapons storage facilities and various military vehicles, Sarah Say takes a look at the human cost of this newest assault on civilians living through this conflict.
A video released by US Central Command yesterday purports to show US targeted airstrikes against Islamic State targets in Syria and Iraq over the past few days, hitting weapons, storage facilities and various vehicles. Videos uploaded onto social media websites show another picture. Although this footage has not been independently verified, it appears to show civilian casualties and damages to residential neighbourhoods in the aftermath of US-led strikes in Syria over the weekend. Early this week, people in the city of Kafr Daryan assessed the damage after the first round of US-led airstrikes in Syria targeting the Islamic State group.
العالم كلها نايمه هون احياء سكنيه حاره فقيره عالم عمال وكذا هيك ونايمين العالم كلها ببيوتات فوجئنا بصوت انفجارات هائله جدا جدا اكثر من 3 انفجارات قويه شديده الانفجار جدا يعني ما قبل سمعنا هيك اصوات يعني.
The airstrikes, which first started in Iraq, expanded to Syria on September the 23rd, with 5 Arab countries joining in the US-led coalition.
بالنسبة للمقرات العسكرية المتواجدة بالقرية فهي تبعد عن خارج القرية بعيد كثير في الجبال. ما عندنا ضمن القرية نهائيا أي مقر أو لأي تنظيم أي مسلح نهائيا. اللي استشهدوا اليوم واللي قتلوا هون تحت القصف هذا هون عوائل نازحت من حلب على أساس تمرق من براميل بشار الأسد اجت لهون لحتى تستهدف بالصواريخ.
According to the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, 22 civilians have been killed since the US airstrikes began, while 57 al-Nusra fighters and around 200 Islamic State fighters have been killed in the airstrikes. But the impact of the strikes on the group's capabilities is not immediately clear. While the US claims major successes over the group's military power, it appears that the Islamic State group has in fact gained support among other groups, including former rivals, following the attacks. The US Central Command has said that it will continue targeted airstrikes in Syria and Iraq, despite many questioning their effectiveness, with fears that the airstrikes are complicating the situation on the ground further, and a ground offensive not off the table. For the civilians on the ground, they now have to contend with yet another player in this continuously shifting conflict. Sarah Say, The Report.
Well, with me in the studio to discuss this is Dr. Mohammed Najjar, a Syrian political activist. Welcome. Now, the Assad government has actually welcomed these airstrikes. I mean, what's your view? Are they making things better or worse?
Well, in my view, this is complicating the scene in Syria, is causing more damage and more destruction. More civilians are being killed, and we have seen so many reports about so many children that have been killed. And actually, the number of civilians that have been killed by the coalition or the allies' airstrikes is far more than those who were killed, I mean, amongst the extremists. Whether that is al-Nusra or ISIS. There has been so many demonstrations against these attacks, and the people of Syria look at that as another killer joining Bashar al-Assad and his allies to cause more damage and destruction in Syria, and actually to help Bashar al-Assad and support him. This is the way, unfortunately, the Syrian people see these attacks.
But what's your view? I mean, surely IS is not something we should be welcoming to come into Syria, is it?
Of course, but the reality on the ground is quite different from our views, unfortunately. More and more people are being radicalized. These attacks are getting or motivating more and more people to come to the area. So attracting more people is making the situation, the liberal brigades and divisions have actually vanished almost. Most of them have joined either al-Nusra or ISIS. I have heard about the Al-Ahrar, Ahrar al-Sham, who have been hit by the a few weeks ago and lost almost 45 or 50 members of their leaders. Most of the members of this group has joined other groups, Islamist groups. So such a liberal, such a moderate fighters have been taken by some other extremist groups, unfortunately.
What is the way then to deal with the extremist groups? How would you suggest it?
I think the best way, as has been referred by the Washington Post, I think Jackson Deal said in the Washington Post a couple of days ago that the American policy or the Western policy in Syria has to change, and Barack Obama cannot keep ignoring Bashar al-Assad because he is the source of trouble in Syria and the Middle East. He's the one who opened hell on everyone in the Middle East, and the chaos is actually getting from a country to another. I think taking or removing Bashar al-Assad is the key.
But you want to do it by US military power, you mean?
I mean, this is if you're asking me about the solution, this is the best way, I think, to take an effect on the situation in Syria. This is the best way if you want to contain the Sunni rage and anger. And I believe, and I think everyone knows that all these extremists, they are Sunni people, and they believe that Islam, the Sunni community in the whole area, think and believe that this is a war against them, and that the Americans and the Western policy has enabled their enemies, especially in Syria, in Iraq, in Yemen, even in Egypt, enabling their enemies in controlling and being in position again. Like in Iraq, they have left this sectarian government for so long until the situation has become very bad and the whole area inflamed. So you have between Damascus and Baghdad now, this whole Sunni area, let alone what's happening around these two countries. So more and more people are being radicalized. More and more people are being attracted to ISIS, and the number of ISIS people are getting really bigger. And as they said since the beginning, they are expanding, they are not retreating, despite all the efforts by the regional governments and by the American government. The situation is getting bad. And even in the north of Syria, in this little town of Kobani, the Kurdish area, it has been under siege, and the Peshmerga, with the Iraqi government forces, they did not manage to keep these extremists far from the city. As I said, you cannot ignore that the key issue here is Bashar al-Assad. Keeping Bashar al-Assad is going to keep the situation longer and longer.
But I mean, I was in Damascus myself just a few days ago, and I can tell you that people were concerned that there might be American bombing of Damascus, because they saw what happened in Iraq, they saw what happened in Libya, and we've seen on our own screen the civilian casualties from the American bombing in a relatively small village. Now, if there was bombing of Damascus, which you seem to be recommending, that would cause massive casualties, wouldn't it?
Well, actually, unfortunately, the statements made by the American officials, and I think you have mentioned that in your report, in your last article in The Guardian, that there are contradicting statements by the Americans. Add to that the high-ranking officials in the Syrian regime talking about an agreement, a sort of agreement, and that they have been notified by the Americans before this campaign started, and that they have been told exactly what is going to happen, and they were reassured that they will not be targeted. However, the Syrian people know that the situation is quite complicated. They cannot read what exactly is going to happen. This is probably why they are scared, and they fear what is going to happen tomorrow, because there are only few places in Syria, and within these cities, especially Damascus, Aleppo, and some other cities like Idlib, Hama, only few places that are spared from bombardment and spared from attacks, whether by the rebels or by the regime forces, let alone the new campaign on the Syrian people. So I think they have the right to be scared. They have the right to fear what is going to happen next.
I mean, some people are suggesting there should actually now be a common front between the Syrian army and the liberal moderate opposition people who you support against ISIS. I mean, surely ISIS is the main problem at the moment, isn't it?
This is, I mean, this is taken or looked at as a very funny scenario. This is impossible to happen. First of all, the liberal Free Syrian Army, I don't think it really exists on the ground anymore. That could have happened probably 2 years ago, 1.5 years ago, 1 year ago, 6 months ago. But at this very moment, this is impossible to happen, especially after all the massacres and after all the promises, the false promises, unfortunately, and all the red lines that have been crossed, and the possible attack and all. So the Syrian people look at the West now in suspicion. they do not believe, there is no credibility whatsoever in the Syrian street about the West, about America, about the intervention, about the friends of Syria, about any kind of statement that could be said about Syria. There is no trust, there is no confidence, there is no nothing to make the Syrian people believe what the Americans or what the Westerners are saying, unfortunately.
Well, that's a very bleak assessment, but of course it is a country which is in complete ruin, really. But we'll have to end it on that note. That's all we have time for in this part of the programme. But stay with us for the third and final part of our show today, where we'll be discussing the Conservative Party conference. Stay with us.